This is Chasing Squirrels podcast. And the track you hear in the background is Stints by Roystar. The full track can be found at the end of the podcast. More tracks can be found on SoundCloud. Welcome back to Chasing Squirrels. I'm pretty happy to kind of shift gears in the new year, and it's not necessarily, speeding things up or slowing things down, just a different approach to the podcast. I managed to get myself into some new committees at school, and I guess a part of being new year, new me kind of a thing. One of the committees, one of the groups that I connected myself with is the book club at the high school that I'm a teacher at. And, going into these books and trying to find books and connecting with books has always been, a bit of a challenge for me, primarily because I find in some ways I've really shifted to digital books in a lot of ways. I mean, between audiobooks and things that I read on my iPad, it's not often that I actually have paper copy in front of me. So one of the challenges with helping out with this book club is that everything is paper copy, and it's just the nature of the beast. It's the nature of the club. So when I was going into our school library and the librarian was asking me, Clough, what would you like to, which ones do you want? I'll have to say on the front end, and Darren, I'm going to nod to you on this one. I mean, I was kind of joking on the pre-tape saying I picked the yellow book, but part of picking the book that I did, Munro VS The Coyote, was the fact that it stood out to me. I mean, in the stack that they were offering, there were a lot of titles that caught my attention, but it did definitely have a bit of a pop to the yellow color. So good for you for choosing that. And without,
well, I'd love to take credit for that, mate. But that's all my publisher and a fantastic designer who put that together. So they'll be rapt to hear that for sure.
You know what? So I'll and again, with the idea of switching gears around, I have a couple sort of my sketch note in front of me here of questions that I want to throw down, but let's leap off from there. Okay. So just first off, before we talk about the book, could you throw down just a little bit of we could look at it as an origin story. You could look at it as just a backgrounder. Who are you? And you could include where are you? And just anything else that you think I would love to know, which is pretty much everything. But what's your mini bio?
Well, first off, Chris, huge thanks for having me on here, mate. It's terrific to be involved, and you're doing tremendous work. And I know I speak for all authors in saying that, folks who are keen on promoting books and authors, they're the lifeblood for us for sure. So appreciate your time for sure. As mentioned, my name's Darren Groth. You may already pick up that I've got a bit of a funny accent, and that's because I was born in Australia and raised there. Lived there for 37 years, and currently I'm in Vancouver and have been here for 11 years. I'm very proud to say that I'm a Canadian citizen these days, so I'm a proud Canozzie, as I refer to myself, and married a beautiful Canadian who lived in Australia for 20 years. And here's a little note to your students that you should be careful of. This is what Australia can do to you. My beautiful wife came to Australia for a 6-month holiday and came back 20 years later with a husband and 2 kids. So watch out. That's what Australia can do. So be careful if you're going there. And on the writing front, I've been writing pretty much seriously for about just over 20 years. But I wrote a lot as a kid, had a fantastic teacher in grade 7 called Mr. Wade. Shout out to Mr. Wade, who was very big on creative writing, and he sort of turned the tap on for me with that. He would get us to do a new story every week, which I know must have been death for most of the most of the students in the class, but it was fantastic for me. And then even through leaving school and through university, I was writing. I actually did a human kinetics degree, or human movement studies as it was called in Australia, because I was aiming to become a physical education teacher or gym teacher, which I did for 13 years. But all the while on the side, I was writing. I was writing poetry and stories and all this sort of stuff. So in the end, I figured out that writing is actually what I do. And I've sort of, once I'd figured that out, my goal then became, well, if writing is what I do, how can I do it as often as possible? And that's really what continues to drive me to this day. And now we're sort of 7 books along since that revelation.
Yeah, you see, you got me switching gears again. Okay, so here's one way we can make this really, really concrete for, let's say, for the students. They're going to be holding this book in their hand. They're going to be in the yellow book, Munro versus the Coyote. They're going to be looking at the cover. The lead often for book studies or media studies is reading the imagery in front of you. So between the font, the color, the organization, the use of space on there. So just on the offhand, were there different covers that were released for this book?
Yeah, it was published in Australia and as well, and the cover was completely different there. The one thing I'll say a couple of things about the cover for the Canadian US version. It's absolutely brilliant. Everything that is on the cover that forms the face of the coyote is actually relevant to the story. They're all moments or special things or important elements of the story itself. And the font actually is interesting because my previous novel was called Are You Seeing Me? And it did some fantastic things on both sides of the Pacific. And that book was designed by my publisher in Australia, Penguin Random House. And the font, they actually used that font for that previous work. So it was one of those things where publishers look at, well, you've had some success with this book. We want to make sure that people sort of recognize that a little bit and recognize you. So they'll use some of the same elements. And the font was one of those things that that was consistent between those two books. But that picture of the coyote, I remember when I saw it the first time, I thought, this is absolutely fantastic. Whoever has put this together really knows this story and have just done a brilliant job with it. And it's one of those things where a lot of people think that the author has a hand in the design and stuff like that. There is a reason why writers are not involved with anything visual, because generally they're absolutely terrible, like myself. That's why we're words people rather than pictures people. And generally publishers will sort of be kind to the author and include them in the sense of, well, here's the cover and maybe here's another one, and we really like this one. So they're sort of directing you towards the one that they really like. And generally, unless an author has pretty strong feelings about one, then you'll just sort of fall into line. But that was a very easy thing to do with this cover. It was sensational. And I'd certainly recommend, for folks who are reading it, as you go through the story, you'll sort of catch these different elements and these different moments, and come back to the cover and see if you can identify all of those things that are going on.
It's as we're talking, I'm starting to realize how little I know about talking with authors. So I'm gonna, and it's funny. I don't take that as in. I think I can do a conversation. I'm okay at conversation, and I'm a pretty good questioner. But I also realize as I'm holding the book in my hand here, and I'm thinking about the pictures that are on the cover. To me, the images are completely unlocked. And I think when I first looked at the cover, I noticed all the different imagery in there, but I didn't have anything to hang it on. There was nothing there where I was like, oh, this. To be truthful, I didn't even notice the Canadian leaf in the nose. So there's a new little thing that so anyone that's doing the audio right now, go to the library, look online, buy the book. so you can get the image into your head. But I didn't have anything to hang it on. And it's interesting as a summary piece, which often, this could be a task within a classroom, give an overview, like a visual essay.
Yeah.
It's funny. I wish I had spent more time considering the images on the front before I went into the book. Like I wish I had that was then, this is now, because everyone is so loaded with checkpoints. And where I started with this is not knowing how to talk to authors. And maybe it's just I don't know how to talk about books if someone hasn't read the book, because I feel myself constantly creeping up on spoiler alert.
Right.
So I don't know if I should say that. I don't know if I should say that at this point. That I apologize if I drop something. I wish I had a sound effect. I guess I could bleep it out afterwards. We'll do it. I'll offer two versions of the podcast. The one with the spoilers bleeped out.
Well, to be honest, Chris,
but I dig the imagery.
I was going to say, to be honest, Chris, I think I'm probably more of a risk of spoiler alerts. I tend to do that a bit, so I'll keep myself in check, and I know you'll do fine.
We'll see. Again, we'll I guess I could do some editing afterwards, but maybe I will say that too, because part of it is with it when it comes to, I guess, a book club. I don't. When the librarian said, "Yay, Clough, thanks for doing this," they didn't say, here's a way to come at it. They just said, "Here's the book." And I kind of like that freedom. I really do like that freedom, but I know I'm going to be high risk. I'm going to be high risk because there was a lot of little bits that drew my attention in this book, notwithstanding the cover and the bits. The font, that font is cool. Is that you going to keep using this font, or is this a capsule? You think this is one that, or could you even say?
I don't know, mate. I think it's possible that it would continue with more young adult stuff. I'm currently working on something that I think will end up being considered adult literary fiction or general literary fiction. I don't think it sits comfortably in a YA space. It's a story about a failed service dog and a young person who's on the autism spectrum, and the boy is 13, but the story is really told, I think, more from, it's a third person, what we call a third person limited perspective, and so it gives me a chance to sort of tell the story in a way that's a little different from most young adult stuff, which is from first person and tends to get into the head of the young person involved. So that's a long-winded way of saying I'm not sure that this font and these designs would continue with my next immediate work, but I've got ideas for other stuff. And I should mention, I mean, the Munro is my second last release. My most recent one, which came out in September of this year, is a story I wrote with my brother Simon, and it's a departure from my previous stuff. Munro is probably what you'd consider to be contemporary, realistic young adult fiction, although I always like to, the voice of the coyote and some other elements in there I like to think are sort of touching a little bit upon magic realism, which is something I really love. But the most recent book, which is called Infinite Blue, which I wrote with my brother Simon, is a real dip of the toe in that magic realist water. So hence a very different design for that book. And that design is absolutely beautiful too. So I'd recommend people have a look at that. It's the feedback on that cover has just been quite amazing. So we'll see. We'll see if some of those design elements continue on with future work.
So the coyote, and again, I'm going to flow with the go here, and I feel like the as far as the title goes, understandable. Munro could be some dude's name, could just be someone's name, might not even be a dude, and then the conflict that Munro is up against the coyote. So not coyote, but the coyote kind of gives it a bit of a general, I felt kind of ominous. I thought if any human was up against a coyote, that's a UFC match that is in the making. but constantly, well, it sets up conflict. I mean, I imagine that being intentional. It's a little bit provocative. The cover picture has, an animal head shape, and it got me right away curious about the origin story of the coyote, because it seemed to me like that would be the more mysterious character or the mysterious element of this book. And I have to say that as I read through the book, I constantly, like, I mentioned to you my process in reading is Post-it notes. And I found like I have a lot of little Post-it notes that say something like, where's a good one here? Initial impression of the coyote. So that's somewhere around page 6. I'm dropping that one down. Page 21, next impression of the coyote. And then somewhere around page 125. I'm like, okay, now what do you think of the coyote? Oh, page 40, I have another one too. So the coyote, as far as, I guess, here's the question after all that preamble. I wondered about the protagonist in the story. Like, I wondered about who is actually kind of leading the story. And you have Munro and you have the coyote.
Yeah.
When you were formulating this, when you're sort of, in your process, were you measured in sort of making sure that if tit for tat, one got to do something, one got to comment, one would do something, another got to comment? Like, how aware of you were in designing that balance? Because it was good. It kept me hooked right up into the end, wondering, when's Coyote going to show up in the story again?
Right.
And what will spark Coyote's response to things?
Yeah.
So what was it like playing with that balance? See, it's hard to talk about this if no one's read the book, right? I don't want to drop too much in there, but suffice it to say, you have two different characters that are kind of leading the story in some ways.
Yeah.
And how aware of you of that balance?
Yeah, it was. I wouldn't say it was a tricky balance. I think it was more about ensuring that it sounded real and that it came across as authentic. And for folks who maybe haven't had a look at the book, the coyote is essentially Munro himself. So he's a young person, a 16-year-old Canadian who has suffered a terrible trauma with the death of his younger sister, who passed away at school, and he has really struggled with her passing over something in the vicinity of 10 to 12 months. And his folks, who are very caring and loving parents, have struggled with him to try and bring back the Munro that they know and they love. And they end up sort of as a last resort saying, well, what about, because Munro wants to leave school. He wants to get out of school because school he associates everything that was terrible that happened with his sister's passing with school, and he's looking to leave, to basically get out of that scene. And his folks obviously want him to finish school. So they hit upon this last resort of a student exchange. And Munro agrees to go on an exchange to Australia because his sister Evie, who had Down syndrome, had a wonderful Australian teacher, and one of her goals prior to her passing was she wanted to visit Australia. She wanted to go there. And Munro feels like maybe he can find himself again in Australia because of the meaning that's attached to that. And I should say the manifestation of this trauma, this post-traumatic stress situation that he's dealing with, there's a number of things that are going on, both physical and psychological, but the main manifestation of that is this voice that is in his head that is very negative. Actually, not always negative. Sometimes it can be cajoling or sarcastic or any of these sorts of things. And the therapist that he's been seeing has tagged this voice as the coyote. And that speaks to the place, and I should say it's never explicitly stated, but his therapist is First Nations. And the coyote, this label of the coyote is a good one because in First Nations folklore, the coyote is considered a trickster and a prankster and a deceiver. And that's really the essence of what this voice is. So it's Munro versus himself, but certainly in the story, the coyote sort of takes on something of a persona itself. And as I said, really represents the internal struggle that Munro's having to try and find himself again after the terrible trauma that he's experienced. So that's sort of where the coyote fits. And in terms of the balance, it made sense that at certain moments that the coyote would be active, would be talking to him, that it would intrude upon him, or at various times it would try and deceive him into thinking something different to what he's hearing in a conversation or an inner dialogue that he's having with himself. So as I was sort of putting it together, it felt like there were natural entry points for the coyote to intrude, to be intrusive in Munro's life. And then obviously as the story plays out, there's some great significance with why the coyote disappears at a certain time in the story. It makes sense as to why that would be the case. So it was really fun. It was really interesting. And as I said before, I think magic realism is a part of my DNA, but in this story, you would never call this story a magic realist story, but I do look at the voice of the coyote as being a little nod in that direction. And there is a scene towards the end too. Spoiler, won't do any spoilers here, but there is a scene towards the end that certainly fits very, very comfortably within that sort of realm.
It had the coyote had the impact on me, I guess, as the reader, is that I think I flowed between wanting the voice to be something and then getting kind of sucked into what the voice was saying. Like I started to see it less intrusive and just kind of a part of the natural flow. And when the coyote's words would kind of pop up, I had this image of something sort of like, it was less whispering in Munro's ear, but actually having one-to-one conversation. It became quite real. And I don't know if that was a measure of me kind of falling in step with Munro's life, kind of the activities he was going through. And it became, I started to play with, would this be the type of self-talk that I would have given Munro's backstory? So I found it did flow in well with the way the plot evolved. And it was funny, at some point I thought to myself, I haven't heard, like, where is the coyote? Because I thought of, some of the situations that Munro was going through, and I got used to a little bit of that self-talk, if that's what the coyote is at that moment, the self-talk popping in. And in many of the cases, not many, but there were cases where it was sometimes negative, sometimes just provocative, sometimes just sarcastic. Like there was a lot of is provocative, intoxicating type of language that, like, it was, Coyote was always talking like it knew Munro.
Right.
And it didn't the voice didn't necessarily want Munro to move forward.
Yeah.
And so all of a sudden I felt sort of like this sense of lightness. I'm like, wow, yeah, I haven't heard from Coyote in a while. Hope he doesn't show up. It was sort of like, waiting for the creaky board, like just Coyote's back.
Yeah. And
the voice, go ahead, you jump in.
I was just going to make sense, or just going to mention, I hope it makes sense too as to the dynamic of the coyote's appearance and disappearance at various times. I certainly aimed for that. Again, to every author, when they're putting together a fictional story, they want the story to be real and to make sense and to be authentic. And that was a big part of it. If the coyote is around, then there needed to be reasons for that. And if the coyote is not around, there needs to be reasons for that as well. And that was obviously a big part of Munro's journey, is trying to rid himself of the coyote, and the circumstances in which those or the presence of the coyote is either there or not. It needed to be something that the reader goes, yep, I can see that, and that's something that pulls me further into the story, because I can see it starting to, there's shape around this. There's things that keep me drawn. So that's good to hear, Chris. Glad it kept you involved.
Yeah, it did. I did feel like that it was, I felt as if in many ways it was the coyote voice that kept me hooked into, like, it was the, what do I want to say? Not maybe the checkpoints, maybe just the, oh, I don't know what it is. Like, I felt like those were the doorways. Those were the gates that I was moving through with each kind of self-check that the coyote was doing. I felt like, okay, there's a change here. There's a change. And the other interesting thing it did is it actually made me pause for a moment and think about what's changed in Munro.
Right.
So it's not just the coyote checking in necessarily randomly. It's like, what actually happened here? It's like a pinch and zoom kind of a thing. Coyote comments, what actually just happened that would sort of make Coyote comment on it?
Right.
And I think that's what I started to notice when the Coyote wasn't speaking as much. I had to pay better attention to what Munro was doing. Like, I had to kind of cue in, and not only Munro, but the collection of characters around Munro. Like, I had to sort of pay closer attention, because there was no more sort of like tap on your shoulder, like, hey, this is sort of this is a key turning point. They're still happening, even though Coyote's not talking.
Right.
So that was, I engaged that way. The voice. So I play with a little writing myself, and I think to myself, one of the most challenging spaces is where I write outside of my own experience, where I sort of try and extend into a space that I haven't actually lived this stuff. And, there's always a space where if I'm only writing about things that I've lived, well, you have a nice base of knowledge, but maybe it's a little bit dangerous because you're sort of exposing self. You're sort of you're proposing or sort of presenting things that the casual onlooker might not notice, but you kind of need to put in that stuff to make, brushing your teeth interesting.
Yeah.
What's the inner dialogue as you're brushing your teeth in the morning? Yeah. That's overly simplistic. When you were putting this book together, I guess one, I'm curious about how much of you is actually in there. And if so, was it measured? Were you sort of making sure that, only certain amounts of you came through to sort of push to a wider type of story? Or were you sort of aware of the fact that you were writing from a base of lived experience and you wrote this? Or is it on the other extreme of entirely fictional?
That's a great question. And every author will have a different sort of answer to that. My sort of standard response is, some people do ask me about, are you writing faction in, not fiction? And
I haven't heard that before. That's good.
And the short answer is no, but I do draw quite heavily from my own lived experience and my own background. And for Munro, it really started actually with the original conception of this work. And again, for folks who may not be familiar with the story, there's a place in this story, an assisted living residence, which is a fictional place called Fair Go. And Fair Go was actually present in my previous story, Are You Seeing Me? And the idea of that fictional residence, assisted living residence in Are You Seeing Me, was that one of the main protagonists in that story was going to end up living there. And I should say, he actually ends up making an appearance a number of times in Munro, a character called Perry. And so in Are You Seeing Me, that assisted living residence was really just very much in the background. This was going to be a place where Perry ended up going on the back of the story that happened in that novel. And coming out of the back end of Are You See Me and thinking about a new idea, which ended up becoming Munro versus The Coyote, I thought about that living resonance, and this really relates quite strongly to my own experience. For one thing, I was a special education gym teacher for 3 years when I first came out of university. So I had that experience to draw from, and it was obviously quite pivotal and quite life-changing to be involved with that sort of experience. And I'll sort of mention on the call here too that I have a young son, or he's not so young anymore, he's 17, and he is on the autism spectrum and is positioned what we call as moderate classic autism, which is actually smack bang in the middle of the spectrum. Generally, people, when they think about autism, they'll think about the so-called high-functioning end of the spectrum, which is folks who may be very, very verbal, may have savant-like skills. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you may have folks who may be non-verbal, who may have significant intellectual disability, this sort of thing. My son's actually right in the middle. And in coming out of the previous book, in our own lives, in the life of our little family, we're starting to think about life after school for our son. And it's quite likely that he will not live independently, he will not work independently, but there will be opportunities that he will have, and I'm sure that he will enjoy. And so with this stuff a little more top of mind as my son was moving towards the end of his high school experience, it got me thinking about this resonance, about fair go. And I thought, well, if my boy was to go to fair go, what would I want that place to be? How would it operate? Who would be there? And most importantly, what would it reflect? What would I want this place to be in terms of connection and care, and about what it says regarding disability in society? And all of these different things were sort of rattling around in my headspace. So that was really a bit of a jumping off point for this story. There are a number of other ideas as well, and actually I'll mention another one, which came from my experience as a special ed teacher. There was a young student that I taught, and this is back in the 90s, so long time ago. And there was a young student with Down syndrome who had a hole in the heart, and a lovely kid. And this was many moons ago, so I don't know where he's at now. And obviously this was back in Australia as well. But the thing I remember, apart from him being a lovely kid and a real treat to have in the class, the thing I remember about him too was physically he always had blue lips because he had some circulatory issues with his heart problem. And this was something that I grabbed from my experience and gave to the character of Evie in Munro, that this was something that would be associated with her. So, yeah, there was a number of things along the way, but in the original conception of the story, that really, when you start to pull these things and then put them together, suddenly you have a novel, you have a story. I actually liken it to, there's a bird in Australia called the bowerbird, and the bowerbird creates its nest by just grabbing stuff from everywhere, and it could even be junk. It could be, straws or bits of paper and things like that. And the bowerbird is famous for putting together these nests that are pretty much made of anything and everything. And that's sort of how a novel works for me. I grab all of these bits, and a lot of them, well, a number of them can be quite close to home. And when I start building that nest, at some point you actually have a nest in front of you. You have a novel. And as I said, in pretty much every case with every work that I do, quite a bit of that nest can be things that I've drawn from from my own experience. But it may not be lived, it may not be firsthand. Quite clearly, and it was a big reason why I didn't want to tell this story from the first person perspective of the residents in Fair Go, because that's not my story to tell. I chose the first person narration of a 16-year-old Canadian lad, and that was a perspective that I thought was important, not just for the story, but also for what it says about disability. There's a lot of people who speak for the disabled in this day and age, and I wanted the residents to speak for themselves in this story. It was sort of like they could tell me, get out of the way, let us speak for ourselves, let us tell the reader about who we're about and what our dreams are and things we want to accomplish. And they're not beholden to the main character either. And that was really important to me as well. One of the tropes that's associated with disability in particular in literature over the years has been that the person with a disability serves as a device for the journey of somebody else, and they're not fully rounded characters, or they don't have their own voice. And that was a really important thing for me, that the residents, that they were the heroes, they were the stars of the book, even though that I wasn't telling the story through their eyes. And they, as I said, they weren't a device for anyone else's journey. In the end, Munro's journey is his journey. His fight with the coyote is his fight with himself. And the residents, even though they're agents as part of that journey, they have agency themselves. They have their own lives and they have their own thoughts and feelings, and they certainly make those known.
The voice that you gave to the residents of Fairgo, I really loved that, the way that, in the amount of time and space that you have to sort of explore them in the story, because it's running sort of very much parallel to Munro's story. The space that you gave them was so dense, and I'm thinking of a particular scene in there with the vote and the actual facilitator, not the leader, Kelvin, the character that's sort of like the proprietor, the person, the supervisor, the boss of Fairgo, yet completely democratizing the way that Munro gets to participate. I loved how specific and individualized each one of the characters were, and how they welcomed Munro into their family. It brings me to another question, as I was wondering within this story. Actually, I'll do a quick backstory. So I mentioned in our on-ramp when we were talking that I think I mentioned that I've shifted into a new job this year, a new portfolio. So my background has been in a lot of small space teaching. So when I first came into teaching, I was hired. My former life, I was a chef. For a while, I was in hospitality industry, and I came in and I started teaching that at the high school level. And I quickly shifted into special education. I did some guidance, and I did some alternative education. And then I was working for 2 years with students that have been suspended or expelled from their home schools.
Mm-hmm.
And this school year in September, I shifted to an entirely new school, and I'm working in an autism program. I'm working with students to develop some independent living skills. And each one of the students is a different human altogether.
Right.
And what hit me pretty hard is you saying that in, the not the easy, but the common trope would be that one of the characters at Fairgo could very well be just the vehicle for exploring the main character's world. They're not necessarily, there's not a journey there unto themselves. I will say that is the most profound pillar of what I'm trying to accomplish in this new portfolio. And at the same time, the most valuable, trying to see the students as the humans as they are in front of me, and allowing them to express what it is, because basically I'm primarily bringing culinary skills to this program. I'm the third teacher into the program.
Right.
And building programming from my origin story, which would have been in the kitchen, very much structured learning, recipe driven, money driven, is a business. I was running a business for someone else for a long time.
Yeah.
And that's very much my previous experience in working in culinary was the individuals working there were the vehicle for the business. So I've slowly had to let go of that perspective in working with teens, because they're not employees, right?
Right.
They're not there to make education better. They're not.
Yeah.
It's the other way around. And it's taken me a while to sort of develop my sensitivity to that and then add the skill sets into it. And I find this year it's coming to a full circle. So each one of these individuals that I'm working with, and, we're cooking together and learning together, and they're sharing their stories and the way that they share their stories, like all this stuff that's sort of growing in our classroom. Singularly, I have to remind myself that they are not there to make me or education better. And I love how that is a theme. That's a big neon announcement that pushes out of your book. And I think you did it very well.
Thank you for that, Chris. That's great to hear. And it really, it really was a goal of mine with this story, was to bring a different light to intellectual disability in particular. The stats on the representation of disability and neurodiversity in literature, young adult and otherwise, is poor. And there's obviously many marginalized groups deserving of as much representation as possible. The reality of that is, though, that when we talk about diversity and representation and appropriation and things like that, there does tend to be something of a hierarchy involved with that. It tends to start with race and sexual orientation. It can venture into religion, socioeconomic status, gender identity. And again, it's really important that those voices are heard and those stories are told by the folks who live that experience firsthand. The challenge in the area of disability and neurodiversity is for people like my son, who quite literally has no voice, doesn't have a metaphorical voice in literature, and at times has no literal voice in society, or in his home or in his life. And the balancing act that I mentioned before that I wanted to have with Munro and the residents was, the residents in Fairgo certainly have more agency in their lives than my son. But again, to balance that with this idea of that they would not be a device for others. Another trope that is heavily involved with disability, or has been to this point, is something we call inspiration porn, where, again, the person with a disability or the neurodiverse person is a source of inspiration for a main character's journey, changes their life for the better, a la a Rain Man type of situation or something like that. Your students are far too young to know the film of Rain Man, but if they do happen to catch it.
I know it. I remember the movie.
Yeah. And again, not that Rain Man is a terrible story. It's not. But that idea of, again, what we call inspiration porn is something that has been overdone, and it limits the agency that a character with disability has in the narrative. So, yeah, it was really important. And you talked about the balancing act that that I looked to bring between Munro and the Coyote. I think there was more of a balancing act really involved with the residents. As I said, I wanted them to have voice, but I didn't want to speak for them. I wanted them to have their own journeys and their own lives, but still be influential in Munro's journey. And I wanted them to save the day. I wanted them to be heroes in the story. And again, without giving away any spoilers, These residents end up occupying a space in the story at the end, which I don't think is, I certainly haven't read work before that positions people with intellectual disability in this particular way, in how a story is resolved. So there was a lot that I wanted to do, and it all sounds very detached and technical and this sort of stuff. It was all quite organic too. First and foremost, every author wants to tell a good story, and that's always first and foremost. The messages and the themes that surround it always must be secondary to telling a good story. But I was certainly aware that I was coming from a place that there were things that I wanted to say, and things that I wanted the neurodiverse community and the disability community to recognize and to feel like that balance had been achieved in the work.
Did you fall into any holes in writing this? I mean, I could say a hole, a wall, where the book or the story or a particular character fought back, just like almost resistant to making it to the page.
I think the Coyote was very interesting because this idea of the deceiver and the trickster, I wanted there to be, again, no spoilers involved here, but I wanted the Coyote to play ultimate deceiver, and without giving too much away, I'll say that this book, when it was published in Australia and New Zealand, its title was Exchange of Heart. And I love that title. I love Munro versus the Coyote too. I think it's a fantastic title. I do like Exchange of Heart very much as well. And that speaks to a certain element in the story that really, the Coyote, I wanted to be very influential. And people's assumption as they're reading through it is that the Coyote is all in his head. You know, it's all in Munro's head. And all the while, you end up discovering that the Coyote was actually in his heart as well. The Coyote was actually ultimately deceiving Munro in a way that this was not just a psychological manifestation, but it was actually a physical manifestation as well. And that's something that does not become very clear, until you reach a certain point in the story. So there was a lot of shaping and a lot of thinking that I did around that particular piece. In terms of other characters it was interesting. Munro's parents were initially, I didn't have them being as supportive as they have ultimately ended up on the page. I almost wanted there to be some conflict occurring between particularly the father and his father and Munro. But as I got into the story, that one of these things again of returning to this idea of wanting to make sense and wanting it to be real, I figured that my initial thought for that conflict would be that these two characters, who had both suffered terrible traumas with the loss of a daughter and a sister, just were swimming around in that without a lot of clue as to how to reconnect between the two of them. And although I think that can be very relevant, and some of the students listening to this might have lived that experience, where on the back of trauma you have trouble connecting with a parent or with somebody else who was close to that situation. I think what made more sense coming out of the back of that was the way in which I'd constructed these characters. It would actually make more sense that they were trying to do the best thing for each other, rather than having difficulty connecting because they couldn't see past their own trauma. They understood each other's trauma well, but didn't really know how to move forward. So there was some reshaping with that I think was really important towards the end. And I thought it made more sense that you would have parents who were trying to do the best thing with a terrible, terrible situation that occurred. They'd set up a foundation supporting Down syndrome research and this sort of thing. But it was really, and then wanting their son to be a part of that, to potentially not only contribute to a greater good, but to possibly help him with his own catharsis or his journey. But that's where the barrier was, that they were trying their best to do the right thing, and it just wasn't the right thing. And something that ends up being a last resort, in fact, potentially could be that right thing. So there was some resistance with the characters there of the parents too. There was some things that, as I thought things through and the story started to come together, that it was almost a 180 from certainly Munro's dad as to what he looked like in the original drafts to how he turned out on the page.
Can I ask you one more, sort of like a free-floating question? Then I want to just do a couple kind of nuts and bolts questions with you, if I could, about writing.
Yeah.
Do you think about Munro? I think I'm thinking about the ending of the story. And again, I caution, I wrote this down so I would say it quite specifically. But the way the book is left, there's a, it would make me think about him. I think for me, when I think about reading, I think about it also in video gaming as well. Some of the video games I enjoy.
Right.
And movies, if they really, really get in, like if they really get in my head, I think about it like it's like like, what are they doing? What are those characters doing now? And the books that I'm involved with currently, when I close it up, it's like a telephone call. I think to myself, that character, that person is living a life that, because I've closed the book or I've turned off the phone, I no longer have access to. I have access to them just in this moment, in the one connection, whether the words are on the page in front of me or I've got it in my ear as I'm talking to them. And I sort of say, that's the humanity. That's the organic nature of, for me, in relating to other people. And I kind of use the same thing to relate to books. So even when I close the book, I have a measure of where the plot is going. I still have this sort of like I wonder what that character is doing. Insert character's name.
Yeah.
At the end of the book, it's left open in a lot of ways. And I just wonder, as the author, do you think about Munro? Does he come to mind as something more than just, the character on the page or the next steps? I mean, you're the author, so you get great thing is you get to decide,
right. Yeah.
Where Munro goes next, and any of the characters. But there's like I think about Shaw, like,
yeah, right.
I think about the character in there, like, what's going on with that dude? Like, I think about the relationship, that relationship at Fair Go between the two characters. And I don't know, that could be, I won't give that away, but there's a relationship there. And I think about those two together and what their next step in the relationship will look like.
Right. Yeah.
So I start with asking about Munro, but let's say any of the characters, do they come to mind as in, something as sort of simple as I wonder what they're doing right now, or as the, what, I think this is what I'm going to have them do next? How do you perceive them now that the book is finished?
I think it's such a lovely question, and I think it is a great question for authors. I think it's an even better question for readers. I think for readers, when a story really connects, and authors do have a different connection to their stories, because we have so much of what an author does is trying to get things right on the page. There's so much craft and technique that our headspace is involved with. People have asked me about sad scenes or terrible scenes that are not terrible scenes as in awful writing, but scenes with great emotional gravity or gravitas. And people have said, how did you write that? Like, were you in tears as you wrote that, and this and that? And the answer is invariably no, because I'm so busy trying to get the right word and the right sentence and to have that sing on the page. And that's what then the reader hopefully connects with, and they're the ones who are the recipients of that emotional engineering. I should say it's very rare. I never read my stuff cover to cover once it's come out or anything like that. I will from time to time read little bits sort of here and there. I can't remember the last time I read anything from Munro. And again, it's largely because the process is, by the time you get to the end of the editing process, well, the end of drafting, the end of redrafting, the end of editing, and then your mind moves to, okay, what's the next story? What is the next thing that I'm interested in? I don't return to the story very often, except in opportunities like this, Chris, where people are talking about their experience of the story to me, and that actually brings it back to life for me. I will say that when I'm back in that headspace of story, these characters will come to mind at various times. And I mentioned before about a character from the novel previous to Munro, a character called Perry Richter, who makes 3 appearances in Munro versus the Coyote. And because of the link of this story with Fair Go to that previous novel, it made sense that Perry would necessarily make an appearance or two as part of this story. And that was a lovely space to return to. I really enjoyed immensely writing that character in Are You Seeing Me? As I mentioned before, a lot of personal elements that I brought to that story through that character. And to have him revisit me in Munro versus the Coyote was quite special. It was terrific. And the response of readers to that, when they didn't know Perry was making an appearance in Munro, and when they came to it, people tweeted me lovely responses, and actually my copy editor had a lovely response to it, where she was so thrilled that Perry had made a reappearance, and she didn't know that was coming. So I do think about these characters in terms of, if there is a natural follow-on, what might be happening with them. Some people have actually asked me whether I would write a sequel to Munro versus the Coyote. Some people have asked me if I would write Shah's story, not only what happens to him following this particular piece, but also delving into his background. I don't think that's my story to tell. That's a story of a refugee student, and it is based very loosely on my superficial experience of, I spent almost a decade in an incredible school as a gym teacher for migrant refugee students in Australia. And that was life-changing stuff and has really informed my fictional output in a lot of different ways. But as I mentioned before, I don't feel that's my story to tell. I don't think Shah's story is mine to tell. One other character that people felt they would like to see more of is Florence. And to get into her background, there's certainly some allusion to a traumatizing event in her life which resulted in her being at Fair Go and shaping the character that she appears to be in that story. I would probably be more amenable to exploring her story, but I haven't really entertained that with any sort of concrete steps forward. And then when it comes to Munro himself, I have thought a little bit about what his future might have been following the final page of the novel. And it probably says a lot about me. I'm an optimist at heart. I do see I've seen good things ahead for him. I've seen good things ahead for pretty much all of the residents. And so, yeah, it's lovely to entertain from time to time. I don't tend to do it much unless I'm into a news story, and it makes sense that if I might be revisiting some time or place or a character that may have appeared before. And as I mentioned, that was certainly the case with Perry and Are You Seeing Me, that he could be front and center for a little while in this particular tale. Maybe there's another story coming down the line here where Munro and perhaps a Canadian version of Fair Go would make an appearance too. So, but I love that for the readers. I love that readers can see lives continuing on, and when it's made that sort of level of a connection, that's pretty special for an author, that somebody feels that much of an attachment, that they see the future.
Yeah, I think it's like you said, it's the optimism. It's hopeful, and it apart from, let's say, the fact that if someone is still thinking of your characters, they're they're willing to consume more. They want more of the story, which I can see how that, like I said, you get to be the author. These stories come to you and you share them, and if people are digging it, there is a certain amount of pride. Like, you should feel good about someone wondering about your characters, and I could see how when I think about any of the characters here, I get I do very similar things, actually. Let's say with this podcast and other pieces that I've written or created, I don't go back and review and kind of, how do I say this? I'm aware of, no, that doesn't work either. It's challenging to put into words. I guess there's stuff. I had someone else in a podcast, another teacher. We were talking about reflective practice,
right?
And there's an accepted trope in teaching that reflective practice is good for you,
right?
And it's, I wrestle with that, because there's reflective practice and then active engagement in your reflective practice. So it's sort of like, how much do you go back and review your pieces that you've created, and then kind of just sit there? Like, is sitting there and going back and being nostalgic enough? Or so going back and reviewing it also lead into active practice? So if the point is to go back and, you decide to go back into your notes and your planning and, what you did with Munro versus the Coyote, does just the fact of doing that mean that you should take it someplace?
Right.
Or is it enough that you can be nostalgic in your head, and in these moments, like you're saying, someone brings up the character and you're like, oh yeah, like you have you can almost share in the common, like, experience of, I wonder what Munro is doing.
Right.
Because you haven't it's that example of when we get off this podcast right now, you're going to go about your life, I'm going to go about my life, and there will be a moment like, hey, I wonder what the rest of his day looks like. Like, I'm going to have that sort of moment. And so in leaving some of the relationship, it makes, in some ways, the relationship more real. And if the person I was talking to about the reflective teacher's name is Jen Apgar. She's highly reflective,
right,
very philosophical, and she's great at asking questions. And when she flipped, I ended up having to do 2 podcasts with her, because the stuff that I was curious about, the stuff that she was doing, she kind of flipped the script, and we talked about reflective practice and how doing podcasting, how am I expressing my own reflective practice by having these conversations.
Right.
And I don't go back and I don't re-listen. Like, I've never re-listened to a single whole episode. But when I go back through the playlist and I look at the individuals I've talked to, I feel like I go right back. Like, the gravity is so heavy, I get drawn right back to the memory of the conversation. And it's almost like, I don't know, for me, that's almost like more important than the words that were said in the actual conversation.
Yeah, I think
it's mind games.
I think it is a bit, but I know exactly where you're coming from. I think that's certainly how I operate as an author. With you mentioning things from Munro, it takes me back there. It takes me back to the experience of writing it and what I wanted to say, and at times it was difficult to try and make you want the work to transport people. That's ultimately what fiction does, and nothing else does it like fiction on the page of a novel. And you're constantly trying to create that experience of transportation, and it's all consuming and overwhelming. But when you've stepped away from that for a while, and then suddenly somebody's talking to you about just the story and the characters and the experience and the emotion, that's when the craft disappears. You're not thinking about, geez, I wish I'd have used a different word or a different sentence or things like that. It's more about engaging with what brought you to the idea of this story in the first place, and doing that through the experience of somebody else. It's a pretty cool space to be, for sure.
Tell me a little bit about. I kind of glanced over at the book again, and I'm looking at the collage nature of the cover. And for those of you that pick up the book, it's a part of the current White Pine selection. Is White Pine, actually, I'll go in this route first. Is White Pine I actually don't even know. Darren, what do you know about White Pine? How did you get connected with the White Pine? The White Pine, I don't even know what to call it. Like, is it an organization? Is it a...
No, it's
I don't know if
it's an award.
It's funny, I don't even know if I should... It's an award. Okay,
yeah.
So tell me a little bit about how you got connected with this, or how it was made known to you, or...
Yeah, it's a big...
What do you know?
It's a big deal. The Ontario Library Association conduct a fantastic program called the Forest of Reading, and they acknowledge the best works of kids literature and young adult literature for that particular year through these awards. Each of them named after a different tree. There's the blue spruce.
I know of the maple leaf.
Yeah,
I think
the red maple, and the young adult piece is called the white pine. And it's one of those signature sort of awards where if you're lucky enough to be included, and I can't say I'm speaking for every author here, but this is certainly my experience. The white pine was something that I'd been hoping that I might gain that recognition, because I know that it's quite special, and it's sort of like a little bit of a coming of age for an author here. And of course, my experience is quite different, having come from Australia, been over here for a decade or so. I only had my previous work, Are You Seeing Me, published here. I had some other works published back in Australia. But this was my second book in North America, Munro. And I mentioned before that my novel, Are You Seeing Me, did some tremendous things in Australia and New Zealand and other parts of the world, and it was shortlisted in the Governor-General's Literary Awards here in Canada and in the BC Book Prizes. So it just did tremendous things. 2015 was quite a surreal year for me. And Munro, to some degree, I'm writing that a little bit in the shadow of that book. And during the year that we've just concluded, this little novel, Munro, managed to do a couple of things that Are You Seeing Me did not, and that actually felt pretty special. And the White Pine is one of those. And so it's a tremendous feeling of that somebody likes your stuff, which is great. One of the things that I love the most about any sort of recognition is that you're part of a community of recognition. There are other books that are shortlisted for that, and invariably you get to connect with those people, whether it's online or face to face or this sort of stuff. And I love that part of it, that you feel like if your book is lucky enough, and there is a tremendous amount of luck involved with these things. You could have 10 other books that would make a tremendous White Pine list, and it wouldn't include any of the ones that are currently on there. But if you are lucky enough to have your book be picked out of the pile, you're then part of a community. part of that white pine community for 2019. And I particularly love that part of it because writing, surprise, surprise, is quite a solitary pursuit, and there's not always a ton of opportunity to connect with others. You want to connect with readers as much as possible. As I said, I love to connect with the writers as well, and to build that sense of a sort of a collegiate type of feeling, and that's what the White Pine sort of affords me. It's already afforded me wonderful opportunities, including this one today, that I wouldn't have had otherwise. So it's an absolute thrill to be a part of that, and looking forward to more things upcoming through the year.
Where I started that question, and I got distracted by two things. Again, looking at the cover of the novel, and then the spine is facing me. It's just beyond my mic, so I could see the sticker on the side. I'm going to come back to the cover and what the tiling of the cover. You actually dovetailed into it nicely. You talked about the sort of like the solo venture that writing can be, and one of the, if part of this, besides the fact I was jazzed to talk to an author, talk about this book, is also that I'm going to be facilitating, this book club, book talk on a few selections from the White Pine books. And one of the questions that it may or may not come up, but somehow maybe this is a teacher thing. This is the teacher part coming out. You mentioned the sort of like a little bit of the solo mission that writing can be, and it makes me wonder about what that workflow can look like. And I realize every author, every artist, their creative process and cycle is different. But could you shape up a little bit what your sort of writing process looks like? And the reason that the cover brings to me, like I said, it's that collage element of the picture of the coyote. There's space between each of the images, and there's several images on here, but as a whole, it comes together and you get this sort of profile picture of a coyote head. So what are the elements or the pieces of your writing day or writing week or writing flow that, end up in a novel? How do you do it? And I know that's huge. But what are some of the key components, your go-to tools in your writing process?
Yeah, you're right in saying, like, every author is certainly different with how they end up getting words down on the page. I'm not a big, people talk about there's plotters and there's pantsers in the industry. So the plotters are the ones who organize everything to the nth degree, and before they start writing, they'll have everything mapped out to its finest point. The pantsers, who are the fly by the seat of their pants, tend to be the ones who just sort of start and see where it takes them. I tend to lean more towards the pantsers. I will have a sense of a story, an idea. I mentioned before the analogy of the bowerbird, and once I've built a bit of a nest, then it's away we go, and let's see how things go. Munro was really interesting in that respect. The first scene I wrote, interestingly, Chris, you were talking about this scene before, the interview scene where Munro has arrived in Australia and is interviewing for a volunteer role at the residence. That was the first scene I wrote, because I had this picture in my head of all the things I'd mentioned before about what did I want this place to be, and I felt that was summed up in that scene. So it's this idea of, in a regular place, you're getting Kelvin or the manager or people in positions of authority who will make the decision on behalf of the residents to say who will work with them. And I thought, well, no, how about the residents have a say? And it's not that they're a part of the decision-making process, and there is some structure put around that Kelvin's put together, but they have agency. They have a voice. They get to ask what they want to ask, and have a say in the decision that's made for who will be working with them and for them. And that was the first scene that actually came to me, and the first one that I wrote, I don't always sort of start in the middle, and that story actually, well, I should say that scene was originally going to be the start, the absolute start of the story, and it didn't work out that way. But oftentimes I'll start at the beginning. I'll have a sense of the journey ahead. More often than not, I'll have a sense of where it's going to finish. And Munro actually stands out as being a story that I didn't know where it was going to finish, or I had a very small clue, but less clue than I've had with other stories in the past. And so I'll have a thread that I'll look to follow, but there's a lot of organic moments along the way where it's like, okay, now I've constructed this character this way, and now they're in this situation. What happens? What is the next piece? And I love those moments where, and invariably for me, they happen in the shower. Like if I get writer's block or something like that, then it's funny how having a shower, something about the hot water, sort of clears up the fuzzy tennis ball sized brain that I have, and I find some solutions to go forward. And again, writers will tell you about different things where, that they use to get out of their headspace. Could be going for a walk or heading to the gym. And actually, the gym's pretty good for me as well. But the plotters won't usually run into that sort of situation because they've worked it out all prior to hitting the page. So I tend to be a pantser. I don't have much of an outline, but I will have an idea of where to go. And sometimes it's actually writing to a target, writing to this end scene. And that's what's happening with my current story, is I know exactly where this story is going to finish. And now the challenge for me is to write to that point, to get my characters from where they are right now to that final those final scenes. So, but the other thing is too, every story is different. Every story is its own challenge. You would think that after you've written a few of these that you'd sort of have it down pat and that it would get easier. It doesn't get easier. It never gets easier. There are things, you may have more tricks and more clubs in the bag and that sort of stuff, but you don't know anything. You're continuing to sort of start again. You always start with a blank page, and it's like, well, everything I've learned before doesn't make 1 ounce of difference here. It's we're starting again.
That last that last statement it's fascinating to me. This podcast, it's I've never had I think a really crystallized destination with it. Again, when I was talking with Jen Apgar, my colleague, my friend, the question about, what is this podcast to you, Clough, really hadn't really occurred to me to sort of anchor it that way. I sort of had my sense of like deep space exploration, and let's just see what kind of pops up.
Right.
And if it catches me, actually, I'll go to a different route. I assume that what caught my attention, I was actually interested in. So, and with that being a fact, if it caught my attention, go deeper. So my whole kind of researchy basically amounted to my a lot of my social media connections and the blogosphere and stuff that sort of would come into schools as activities and projects and emails and all this kind of like a whole lot of noise. And then something kind of goes bing and you kind of pay attention to, you're like, that's the thing that I think I want to pay attention to right now. And so I would. But I really like this idea that you're shifting gears with the, I don't know, whatever it could be, the angle of the plot, the character that gets in your head, maybe it's a piece of found text, like the thing that kind of starts to create the new rule book.
Yeah.
And here's the question that comes out of this is, I'm going to take you back to, you jumped over this really, really quickly, but I think I have teacher friends that are existing a little bit in the space where they have kind of side hustles. And you said that you were writing the whole time that you were, a lot of the time when you were in education, and at some point, something queued up and you thought to yourself, it'd be a good it'd be good to kind of shift into writing.
Mm,
Like to kind of like, and I'm just wondering if you still are in touch with that, because that's a kind of a tectonic shift. Like there's a lot of energy in that moment, but I always wondered about what happens just on the other side of that decision. Because for myself, if I were to decide to pursue podcasting as a professional endeavor, there's a lot that there's a lot I would gain, no doubt, but there's a lot that you're walking away from too.
right.
So as you were kind of mentioning, um, this is a new rite of passage that you didn't even expect. Could be awesome, could be challenging. But I'm curious if I could take you just back to that moment of deciding to leaving education in sort of like in a technical fashion. Because I would say, funny enough, you're still in education,
Absolutely.
dude. You're still an educator in a parallel universe
Yeah.
kind of way. So can you go back and what was it like? That's a bad question.
No, I
Can you no, I just mean in the it's not I don't want to necessarily take you back there, but it's really kind of like formalize, like after you made the decision to sort of say, I'm leaving teaching. I like to put the now what.
yeah.
So what was the next thing that kind of what did you notice about yourself when you finally said, yeah, I'm going to leave teaching. I'm going to pursue this. I got to go whole hog at it.
It's
Can you go back there?
yeah, I can. It's a brilliant question, and funnily enough, I have quite a definitive answer for it. I tell this story to I've done tons of school visits over the years as an author since stepping away from teaching, and I must say there's a lot of authors who do a tremendous job with schools and with students, but it's not the favorite part of their day. I'll say that they're not necessarily, they might be introverted, and they sort of do it because it's important, and they do like talking about stories and connecting with readers. But the idea of standing in front of 300 students in an auditorium and putting on a show may not be their usual cup of tea or their preferred cup of tea. But for me, that's something I really love, that part of it, because it does take me back to my teaching days. It's obviously very different, but the chance to connect with students and to sort of pretend to be a teacher again is actually really, really cool for me. The moment where I mentioned about where I figured out that writing is what I do, I tell this story to young people in school sessions, where invariably people ask young people, what do you want to do when you finish school? And I think that's the wrong question to ask young people. And the follow-up might be, well, I don't know. I'm 16. I don't have a clue. Give me some time, for God's sake, all this sort of stuff. And rightfully so. The follow-up question might be, well, what is it that you like to do? And sometimes there might not even be a good answer to that question either. And I think I encourage the students to ask themselves, and also for educators to ask their students, don't ask what do you want to do, don't ask what do you like to do, ask what is it that you do. And it's this idea of when somebody has their own time, their own space, and they're inside their own head, what is it that they gravitate towards? And it may seem innocuous, or it may seem not very productive, but I can guarantee there's something in that. It's this classic idea of, what a young person gravitates towards may be seen through the lens of an adult or an educator, and it may not be seen as being valuable. But if you dig a little deeper, you'll see that there's something in that. And maybe there's some actual steps forward in terms of career, or something more material and I guess, something you can grasp. But it speaks to the deeper person themselves. I had that experience sort of out of the blue when I was 23, and I was playing basketball with some high school friends of mine at my old school. And throughout my youth, I'd been a pretty good athlete, And I'd sort of had this amorphous dream that I would become an athlete and that I would be discovered. Somebody would discover me, and I didn't have a clue what the sport would be. I was good at a number of different sports, maybe athletics or cricket or who knows. And maybe it's something I hadn't even tried yet. Maybe I was a natural at something and I hadn't even done it yet, but I'd be discovered. One day a coach would see me and say, Darren, you're incredible. Like, I can't believe that you haven't been discovered to this point. Let's make it happen. And I was playing basketball with some friends of mine. I was 23, so certainly not beyond my athletic prime. But I was standing at the free throw line with the ball in my hand, and my friends will actually tell you that they heard this. I said this out loud, that I was about to shoot the ball, and I stopped, and I said out loud, I am never going to be an athlete. And I had no idea where that came from, and I didn't really understand its implications. So I went home, and somehow I arrived back at this idea of, well, what is it that you do? And clearly sport and playing sport was something that I enjoyed, that I loved, I was good at it, but it wasn't what I did. When I had no other obligations, when I had my own time and my own space and I was in my own head, I didn't gravitate towards playing sport. What I gravitated towards was the page. I would write stuff. I would write stuff down for no reason. I wasn't getting published back then. I didn't have agents. I didn't have any career. I didn't have any expectation of anything. I just had something in my head that I wanted to put down on the page and to see it there in front of me, and hopefully in a way that actually made sense to the idea that had been in my scon. So I figured out, well, this is what I do, like writing. This is what I do. And as I mentioned in passing earlier in the podcast, the natural next question for me is, okay, well, if I've worked out that this is what I do, then how can I do this more often? How can I get the opportunity to do this more often? And part of that was a pragmatic response, because I know that a career in the creative arts is a very difficult journey. You know, not everyone's Stephen King and J.K. Rowling and, you know, that level of success, quite obviously. And, you know, these days I still have a full-time job that I do, and I have, as I mentioned, a beautiful wife and twins who are 17. And me as the primary source of income for our family, I'm not going to throw that away in pursuit of what I do. But that doesn't stop me from doing what I do. And as I said, that question of how can I do it more often, it's changed over the years. There have been times when I've been able to do it a lot. There have been times when I haven't been able to do it much at all, and that's fine, because, you know, first couple of years of the twins was just bananas. It was crazy. It was fantastic. Didn't afford a lot of spare time to put some words down on the page. Back to your question about, you know, how it related to teaching. So once my second novel was a novel called Most Valuable Potential, and it was actually based on the school. The setting for that novel was the school where I worked, this amazing migrant refugee school in Brisbane, Australia. And I had some success with that novel that allowed me to step away from teaching. And I didn't really want to go back to it. And this is sort of the irony of that decision is I always consider myself a teacher. I think I will always be a teacher. But a couple of things. One, I felt like I had experienced the very best that teaching could offer, and really by accident. You know, I'd been a special ed gym teacher for 3 years and then taught in this amazing, life-changing place for almost a decade. And going to a mainstream school, I know there would have been tremendous experiences there and tremendous connections with students, and it would have been different. But I sort of felt like I think I might have experienced the very best of what teaching can be. And the other reason sort of driving at a decision to step away was that writing was what I do. That was the other thing. You know, if I talk about it in terms of teaching was my professional wife and writing was my professional mistress, and the mistress was pretty enticing. And I felt like you can't stay in the marriage with the professional wife if your heart is elsewhere. And because that's the regard I have for teaching. I've seen teachers who are the absolute, and I suspect you might be one of them, Chris. I've seen teachers who should be earning hundreds of thousands of dollars because of the influence they have on the next generation. And they are brilliant at every aspect of what they need to be brilliant at. They're brilliant in front of the class. They're brilliant behind the scenes. They're brilliant at collegiate relationships with other teachers. They're brilliant at big picture. They're brilliant at the nitty-gritty. I've seen those teachers, and they should be earning $500,000 a year. And they wouldn't, and they're not doing it for that. If they were getting paid that, it wouldn't matter, because they do it because they have the heart and they have the passion for it. I had a lot of heart and passion for teaching, and still do, but it was sort of divided because, again, writing is what I do, and I think it's what I do best. I think it's actually, I'd learned a lot as a teacher, and I think I was a pretty good teacher by the time I was stepping away, which is sort of ironic. But writing is what I actually did best. And I'll never forget when I decided to step away, and I was actually telling some students at Milpera, this school for migrant refugee students. And I was telling these students, I said, you know what, this is actually my last couple of weeks here, or whenever it was, because I'm going off to do something new. And they said, what? And I said, well, I actually, I write. And they said, we had no idea. You never mentioned this before. What's going on there? And the implication was that, and I was really pleased about this, was they hadn't figured out that I had something of a divided heart, that I had something else that I really loved, and I loved a little bit more than them. And the fact that they hadn't figured it out made me feel good, because I know that the moment that students did figure out that I wasn't 100% in with passion and heart for them, that's the time to step away. Or, well, you should be stepping away prior to that, because those students, particularly those students, deserve the sort of teacher that I was talking about before, who has it all, including that 100% heart and passion. And it sort of made me feel good, but it also made me feel like this is the right decision, because eventually I was going to get found out as something of, not an imposter, that's a little strong, but they would have figured out that, you know what, you got something that you love more than this game. And me as an idealist, and as having such great passion for the profession and vocation of teaching, I didn't want to be someone who was in the game for 30 years and justifying staying there on the basis of holidays or RSP or things like that. I wanted to be, if you're doing it, you need to be doing it for the right reasons. So it was a really interesting time. I haven't returned to teaching since, but I do get these in my current day job. There's actually a training component, and it's, of course, very different from teaching in schools, but I get to use some of my favorite things that I learnt in my time as a teacher, like cooperative learning technique, and the true skills involved with creating group work, and creating great pedagogy. Cooperative learning changed everything for me. The way in which I approached teaching, games like basketball or handball or volleyball or things like that, using cooperative learning technique and having groups actually function the way you want groups to function and not pretend to function as a group. It really changed everything. And I still get to use those things in my day job, and I use them in school visits, when I go, especially in workshop situations where you might have a dozen or 15 kids. Being able to use those techniques, it feels like I'm still connected to the profession. So it was a really, really interesting time. And as you rightfully put it, Chris, I still feel like I'm a teacher today, and not just through the page and not just through the books, but through things I'm actually doing in the flesh as well.
I love how you took away my, not took away, but you completely fleshed out the last question, where I was going to ask you something about kind of what do you know about your own sort of change driver, like when you know you need to kind of switch stuff up. I mean, I think you you isolated it pretty clearly, that that the passion pulled you in a direction. I love that sort of split, that thing of having the split heart, sort of having two interests, and having your students recognize and feel that you were there, like, and the bit of the surprise. I mean, that's sort of one of those moments that many of my colleagues have sort of wrestled with when they knew they were transitioning to a different department, or they were moving from in-class teacher to an administrator role, so becoming a principal. At what point do you do the grand reveal to your students? Some of the reasons are entirely practical, as in they just don't want to create any confusion of loyalty. But I find time and time again, it comes down to the emotional, realizing full well that something happens on the other side of that decision. And I think that despite the complexity of some of those emotions that pop up on the other side when you choose to share with your students, or your colleagues for that matter, that you're shifting, there is a I almost want to say there's a grieving time in there, where individuals have to get used to another part of you, and the students need a lot of support, colleagues need a lot of support, and it takes time. I can remember a principal, David McAdam. He was a mentor. Shout out to David McAdam. He was a mentor of mine, and I shifted very quickly. He was a principal at a school, and he asked a question that still rings with me, is, when do you know your team is ready for you to leave?
Right.
So this was in response to me sort of shifting my interests and giving off a committee position, saying, I'll train this group up. I'll train them in what I was doing so that they're good to go. But this was after the fact that I had shifted.
Right.
I didn't give any on-ramp. And he said flat out, he goes, I can appreciate your desire to change, but how do you know your team was ready for you to go? And I had never thought of it from that point of view. And it's still something that I kind of wrestle with, as in how much groundwork do you do in advance of shifting, when I've sort of experienced that on the other side of shift, there's a whole lot of work to be done as well.
I think if you know you're coming from the right place in making the change, then I think then the experience and of the recipient of that news or of that change, and I certainly felt this was the case with students. I mean, they were really smart, and they knew teachers who could do the business, and they knew teachers who couldn't. And everybody who's worked in education knows that you'll have teachers who say, this kid can't do this, and they can't do this, and they can't do this. And in somebody else's class, they can. And there's a reason for that. And often what's forgotten is that the student is really smart, and they know that, they may not have respect for that teacher because they can't do the business, or that's just not put together in a way that makes sense for them, whereas here it does. And so I think it's similarly the case where, I felt like in making the decision to walk away, that I was being honest and I was being truthful, and I wasn't blowing smoke for these guys. And they recognized that. And they also knew where I'd been coming from prior to that, that when they understood that I was all in all the time. And then they said, well, you know what? I guess we can see that you're all in when you're with us. And the things that they couldn't see were the only things that were missing. So again, I mentioned about the greatest teachers have got it all. And it's not just being great in front of the class and that sort of stuff. It's behind the scenes as well. And that's where I think, it's this idea of, I think with teachers, if you have 100% heart and passion and commitment, but your skill level is maybe not where it needs to be, then that will come, because the passion will drive that. It will drive the acquisition of skill and of better performance in front of the class, and better behavior management, and better accounting for individual difference and all that sort of thing. But if you have those skills, if in front of the class is your real strength and you are brilliant with that stuff, but you don't put in the behind the scenes work, the nitty gritty stuff, those skills will eventually atrophy. They'll fall away a little bit. And again, thankfully, I don't think my students had seen that with me yet, but it would have happened. Like, it would have happened eventually because of that split heart that I had. So again, in leaving them with that news of, here's what I'm doing next, and unfortunately it doesn't involve you guys, they could put together the sum of all their experiences with me and connect it with that news and say, well, you know what, actually that makes sense. And we will sort of move on without you, and thank you for what you brought. And it's probably the same with you, Chris, with your decision to make change. You strike me as a guy who is coming from a really good place, and people would recognize that. They would see that and not begrudge you the change based on their own sort of experiences or what they're going to miss. But they would see it for what it is and see it for its truth.
Thanks, man. I appreciate that. I think that becomes that's the struggle. that's the struggle. I would definitely say that, back to what that principal said to me about recognizing it wasn't him saying don't change.
Right.
It was just a matter of him saying, keep a really wide view of this, because there's going to be individuals that you're going to spend some time managing them and caring for them while you transition at the same time that you're caring for your own transition.
Right.
And it's an interesting, very humanistic way to look at change, because there's a whole lot of really singular individual reasons that can motivate us to sort of springboard to that next thing. And if, for some people, if there's an element of escapism in it, it's easy to sort of like cut and run. So that's, right. I take his words to heart, and I appreciate your observation as well. I hope that's something that is a part of what my colleagues' experience of me is, and what my students' experience of me is. And who knows what I could shift to next?
Maybe a novelist.
I haven't been maybe I haven't been distracted fully yet. I haven't split up my heart. You know what, dude? I'm gonna call it here if you're cool with that.
Absolutely.
Are
you
good?
Yeah. We've covered a lot of territory for sure.
I do want to throw it over to you though. The individuals that are reaching out to you, that want to connect, that want to continue, or just bounce ideas back and forth, where do you like to be found?
The folks can find me on my website at darrengroth.com. Also, Facebook, Darren Groth Author, on Twitter at Darren Groth, and Instagram is actually a shared one with my fantastically talented brother Simon. We are the Brothers Groth on Instagram. You can keep an eye out for us there as well. So plenty of platforms, and feel free, drop me a line, say g'day. Use your worst Australian accent. I've heard the worst ones, and yours won't be the worst. So anything you want to ask, it's all good.
Thank you for your time. I appreciate you. I really appreciate you. I expect this will be a bit of a gift for the students. Any of the book talks I've been a part of haven't had necessarily some of the authors, well, let alone just hearing their voice, right? Hearing the voice apart from the book. So I'll, I'll reach back out to you, because there could be some, I'm gonna push him to say, reach out to this dude. He's willing to chat and see if they can get, any other storied or story questions to you. Okay.
Sounds fantastic. Got plenty of stories, and really I look forward to keeping in touch for sure, Chris.
Thank you, Darren. Have a wonderful new year, and we'll be in touch soon, I'm sure.
Look forward to it.
Cool. Take care.
Cheers, mate.
Thanks again for checking out Chasing Squirrels podcast. Other episodes can be found on iTunes and Podbean, and the music that's taken us out of this podcast is from the artist Roystar, and the track is called Stints.
Thank you.